Today, we will be discussing the interwar period between World War I and World War II. We will be discussing 5 people, 5 events, 5 ideas, and 5 extra points. Number 1, the Great Depression. This is the time that began in 1929 when the U.S. stock market crashed. Employment severely dropped as a result of the Great Depression. Germany's Weimar Republic was failing because loans to help them after World War I were stopped. Germany's post-war debt helped outside countries only slightly, however. The bank around Europe crashed, sending them further and further into frenzy. People suffered from homelessness, famine, and population decrease. Number 2, Kristallnacht. November 9th and 10th, 1938. Jewish homes, businesses, and schools were vandalized. This was known as the Night of Broken Glass. 30,000 Jewish men were sent to concentration camps, and this was the first event of violent policies towards Jews. Number 3, the Spanish Civil War. Nationalists received aid from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Germany and Italy became allies through this. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans. Many people were killed, not just from violence, but from disease and starvation. This is significant as Germany's way of testing new tactics and new weapons. Number 4, the Enabling Act. This was Hitler's act put into place on March 23, 1933. It was officially called the Law of Removing Distress of the People and the Right. It tore down democratic German Republic legally and allowed Hitler to achieve dictatorial powers. This put the Reichstag as more of a cheer squad for Hitler than a decision-maker. Number 5, the New Economic Policy. This policy, implemented by Vladimir Lenin in Soviet Russia, was the return of most agriculture, retail trade, and small-scale light industry. This was a system to help the government and country recover. It took a step away from socialism, which Stalin hated, and the country slowly but painfully began to recover. Next, the 5 people. Number 1, Joseph Stalin. He ruled from 1929 to 1953 and transformed the Soviet Union from a peasant society to an industrial and military power. He utilized purges and the 5-year economic plan. He won over Leon Trotsky for control of the Communist Party. He collectivized agriculture and killed thousands of opposing kulaks. He established Soviet control and influence over satellite nations connected to the Soviet Union after World War I through communist support. Number 2, Adolf Hitler. He was the Chancellor and dictator of Germany. He began the Holocaust and led the Nazi in the failed coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, and began actions that would result in World War II. He used the final solution, a system of concentration and death camps, to persecute and eliminate Jews, Polish, anyone who opposed his ways, the mentally ill, handicapped, gypsies, and homosexuals. Number 3, Benito Mussolini. He was the dictator of Italy, known for fascism, and he extended fascism in Italy and led the March on Rome and protest against conditions resulting from World War I and the Great Depression. He extended Italian control overseas into Ethiopia and Albania. He forged an alliance with the papacy, which resulted in the formation of the Vatican City State. Number 4, Leon Trotsky. He ruled from 1879 to 1940 and became involved in underground activities as a teen. He was exiled to Siberia and joined the Social Democratic Party. He was a member of the Menshevik faction and developed his theory of permanent revolution. He later joined the Bolsheviks and played a crucial role in keeping the regime alive. However, he was later outmaneuvered by Stalin. Number 5, Victor Emmanuel II, prominent from 1820 to 1878. He was the first king of United Italy and last king of Piedmont Sardinia. In 1850, Piedmont Sardinia remained the only constitutional state in Italy. 9 years later, he was assured of military support by Napoleon III of France in the Treaty of Pompeius, and Piedmont Sardinia again went to war with Austria. He insisted on retaining his dynastic designation of Victor Emmanuel II rather than becoming Victor Emmanuel I of Italy. The 5 extra points begins with the Weimar Republic. Germany's political system between 1918 and 1933, from the end of World War I to the end of the rise of Nazism. This attempted to create a modern liberal democracy, but the attempts failed and lasted only 15 years before it fell to Adolf Hitler. This demonstrated why and how democracy can fail if people are too ambitious and has forces working against them. This is an example of a society torn between old ideas and values. Number 2, Mein Kampf was Adolf Hitler's published compilation of his personal worldviews. This was written as an autobiography while in prison, and Hitler had arrived in prison after joining the German Workers' Party and transforming it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi. In hopes of beginning a mass political movement, Hitler led his group in the Beer Hall Putsch, in which they staged an armed uprising in Munich, and these actions led to Hitler's reassurance of himself and his realization that the Nazis must use constitutional means to gain power. These fundamental ideologies included extreme German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and his belief in the necessity of struggle. Acting on these beliefs, Hitler proceeded to introduce the idea of Führerprinzip, a single-minded party under one leader, and people quickly followed, as seen by the fact that in 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor, and in 1934, Hitler bribed the army to become president upon Hindenburg's death, a position he abolished and became sole ruler of Germany, completing his legal seizure of power. Now, Hitler set out for a total state, with many methods including mass demonstrations, such as the Nuremberg party rallies, economic improvements such as pump priming, or grants to private construction firms to foster employment, the implementation of the SS or Protection Squads for Terror, and organizations such as the Hitler Youth and German Girls Association to indoctrinate the youth and ensure allegiance. One of Hitler's primary goals was to develop an Aryan racial state, which included a terrorist attack on Jews and the characterization of Aryan women to each have a duty to stay home and preserve the race. This was the basis for one of the most violent totalitarian states. Number three, the 5-year plan. This was implemented by Stalin in 1928 and was a plan of increasing industrialization in the Soviet Union. Collectivized farming was pushed in. All farms were made into collective ones, and kulaks were killed. Stalin was worried the country wasn't strong enough to defend itself, so he enacted the plans to get the country into capable shape of defense. Number 4, the Age of Anxiety. This was during the 1920s when many countries were teetering on the collapse of war. The Great Depression caused anxiety all around the world, and things such as the Spanish Civil War, occupation of the Ruhr, and collapse of the Weimar Republic made people nervous. Mass unemployment was a large part of the 20s. Lastly, the 5 ideas begins with number 1, fascism. Fascism was a political movement founded in Italy by a man named Benito Mussolini. After expulsion from a socialist party, Mussolini established his own group, the League of Combat, and set out to gain support, especially from middle-class industrialists, at a time when Italy's politics were in decline. With a common goal of destroying socialism, Mussolini allied with the liberals in order to legally utilize his armed fascists, called squadristi, revealing his belief in violence, whereas he had falsely portrayed his party as orderly. When Mussolini threatened to march on Rome in 1922, King Victor Emmanuel III made him Prime Minister of Italy, and the fascist blackshirts feigned their invasion. By 1926, Mussolini had his fascist dictatorship after winning the majority in parliament and made himself head of government. In fascist Italy, government and the secret police, or OVRA, punished anti-fascists, and simple propaganda such as Mussolini is always right was on the walls. In hopes of a new Italian, young fascists were established to train young people in militarization, and women were expected to stay home and bear many children. Although Italy was changed, there was more words than actions, saving Italy from the fate of Germany and Russia. Number 2, anti-Semitism. In the interwar Europe was, by definition, the discrimination against Jews. Although anti-Semitism had been occurring previously in history and all throughout Europe, it did so at a climactic rate during this time, especially in Germany. At the root of Adolf Hitler's ideologies was the hope of a pure Aryan racial state. Therefore, he invested more effort into the emigration of all Jews than he ever focused on the war effort. Through the implementation of Nuremberg laws and death camps, later entitled the Holocaust, Hitler was the mass murderer of 6 million Jews. However, anti-Semitism was also present in other European nations. Totalitarianism was an abstract term for extreme right or left-wing authoritarian governments that rose to prominence in the early 20th century. It originated in the concepts of total warfare in World War I, in which governments assumed power of economics, politics, and social freedoms. Now, totalitarian states also wanted control of the intellectual and cultural aspects of life, and they utilized propaganda and police control to ensure the unification of the country under one leader and one party. The best examples of the 20th century include fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and communist Russia. This raised dictatorship to an unprecedented level and revealed the similarities of the extremes on the political spectrum. Number 3, appeasement, was a political policy prominent in the time surrounding World War II that suggested that by satisfying the reasonable demands of dissatisfied European states, these nations would be content and stability and peace could be achieved throughout Europe. The greatest example of this was in Britain, especially under Neville Chamberlain, who both wanted to avoid war and also favored Nazism over communism, as seen by the Anglo-German Naval Pact, and even more so at the Munich Conference. However, this explains how power was diplomatically handed over to Adolf Hitler. Central planning was a general term for handing over total control to government. This was most applicable in the economic policy of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Through the implementation of 5-year plans and collectivization, the government possessed complete economic power. The first 5-year plan was launched in 1928 with the goal of transforming Russia from an agricultural country and consumer goods into an industrial state focused on maximum production of capital goods. As a result, steel production and coal output increased drastically, while workers' wages and living conditions declined. As for collectivization, people were pushed onto collective farms, eliminating private farms and therefore creating agricultural surpluses needed for industrial growth. The first steps were to send kulaks or wealthy farmers to